Welcome back to Fossil Ridge Games. Today we are talking about Shadowcat for Marvel Champions living card game. Shadowcat is a phasing character, which means that you're going to have a double-sided card which goes between phased and solid over the course of the game. So when you're setting up Kitty Pryde for your first turn, she's going to start in the solid mass form. She also has a special ability. It's an action. You can flip your mass form upgrade and you can limit it once per turn. So essentially what this is saying is that you can start in any of the forms that you would like because you get a free flip, essentially. Now, when you turn her over, she has pretty average stats. She's got a 2-2 and a 2 for all her core ability scores, and her hit points are set to 9, which is not great, but that's kind of an average value for the lower end of characters. Obviously, you really hardly ever see below 9. And then she has this selective intangibility skill. It's a little bit situational, but I'll go ahead and go through it with you. While you are in phased mass form, Shadowcat ignores the guard and patrol keywords, so note that it's in the phased form only. And in addition to that, any crisis icons that are on any of those schemes that are in play. Here's a quick overview of the two different phased forms. So while she is in phased form, if you are defending, you cannot take damage. That's a pretty hefty special ability. High survivability, that's typically going to be used, and you want to use that when something's hitting you really hard, typically the villain. Now, if you look at the bottom, this is a forced response. This is something that you can't control. So if this trigger goes off, it forces you to flip the card after you attack or defend. So that's the key, attack or defend. In phased mass form, which is this form, you flip the card over, okay? Then you're going to go back into solid form. And this one's a little bit interesting too. You can exhaust this card to generate a resource. So that's pretty fantastic, and I'll kind of show you some of the stuff that you can do with that. And then also too, this is the same thing at the bottom. After you attack or defend in solid mass form, you flip the card. So you could have some resource generation specifically for an attack or defense event, and then that will essentially trigger you to flip back and forth. So over the course of the game, you're going to be flopping back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So when you're doing deck construction, be sure to look for cards that trigger every time you change form. That's very key, that's very critical. Let's take this concept a step further. So we have Shadowcat in phased mass form, which means that selective intangibility will trigger. While you are in phased mass form, Shadowcat ignores the guard and patrol keywords and any crisis icons. So she also has 2 upgrades that come in her hero cards. First one's going to be acute control, and this one simply says, after you ignore the guard or patrol keyword on a minion, exhaust acute control to deal 2 damage to that minion. So that's kind of great. But once again, this is kind of highly situational. Next, we have intangible interference. Same thing. After you ignore the crisis icon on a scheme, exhaust this card to remove 2 threat from that scheme. So kind of where this gets situational is that obviously you have to be in hero form and you have to be in phased mass form. Then on top of it, you have to come across something with the guard or patrol keyword or a crisis icon sort of keyword. So keep that in mind when you're playing this. Some of the players had a little bit of difficulty with this concept when we first started playing the game. They just kind of wanted to use it all the time, but it's a little bit more situational than that. All right, as for other permanents in this deck, you have this ally. It's a pretty decent ally for a cost of 2. When it comes into play, it triggers a different effect based upon what mass form she's actually in. So go ahead and check that out when you're playing the game. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, this is going to be, you know, a typical alter ego sort of support card that you see in a lot of the hero decks. This one does, if you are in solid mass form, you can heal 2 damage from Kitty Pryde. And then the other one says, if you are in phased mass form, you get to draw a card. All right, so kind of as a general rule of thumb, when you're playing this character Shadowcat, it seems that a lot of the cards in the set really key off of the phased mass form that you could be in. And so the next couple cards that I'm going to go over are no exception to this. The first one's going to be Phase Strike. So this is going to be a damage dealing card, which is an attack. So deal 6 damage to an enemy. If you're in phased mass form, you may discard an attachment with the text hero action or hero response from that enemy. That is an extremely powerful ability. When you're playing Marvel Champions, oftentimes the villain will get these upgrade cards that are stacked on them, and it takes either a hero action or a hero response to remove those cards from that enemy. Those can be super impactful when you're playing the game and can be really, really deadly. So in my opinion, this is a really excellent card to deal with those upgrades that are placed onto the villain. So that's a massive advantage for this character. Next up, we have Airwalk, and this says remove 2 threat from a scheme, or 4 if you are in phased mass form. So just note that the game in general, and when this character was made, it really kind of focuses on the phased mass form to trigger some of these additional abilities. Next up, we're going to talk about a fantastic upgrade. It's called Phased and Confused. It's going to be placed onto an enemy. So that can be a villain or a minion, which is fantastic. It says Force Interrupt. When attached enemy would attack, discard this card instead, then confuse that enemy. So this is going to prevent attack from either a villain or a minion, and then it's going to confuse them after that occurs. This is an absolutely fantastic card, and it gives you the ability to basically negate one attack and then confuse that enemy. The other thing that I really like about it, and we found kind of funny, is that it synergizes well with Cyclops. So Cyclops says, spend 1 resource of any type, deal 3 damage to an enemy with an upgrade attached. So obviously Cyclops is going to be dealing with enemies with upgrades attached. So we found time and time again that it's great to also put your own upgrades on enemies if you can, and then that gives you some extra synergistic effects. There are going to be 2 copies of Quick Shift in this deck as well. And this is going to be a defensive card, and it's going to key off of what mass form you're in again. So you can be in either of the mass forms. So if you're in phased mass form, which is this form, you can draw 2 cards. Or if you're in solid form and you are going to perform a defense action, you can actually flip over to the phase mass form, which is fantastic because this side allows you to, while you're defending, you can't take damage. So let's say you get attacked, you can always play this event, this interrupt, really quickly to flop over and then take 0 points of damage from an attack, which is absolutely fantastic. So kind of once again, we're seeing that, hey, really the name of the game is to swap over to phased mass form. So this card, in my opinion, also favors phased mass form. And then finally, we have 3 copies of Shadowcat Surprise. This one just simply deals 3 damage to an enemy, and then it allows you to ready your hero. So what you can do is obviously play this down, and then you can ready your hero and then do something else with your hero. So anytime you see in a character's cards, and there's 3 copies of this, by the way, where you can ready your hero, it makes you want to do those types of decks where you are readying and exhausting your hero multiple times. So think about any of those styles of buff cards where you can, let's say, buff your attack for the entire round, so to speak, and then you can exhaust your hero multiple times, or threat reduction, things like that. So think of those styles of decks when you're building Shadowcat decks, and those can be pretty effective as well. So what our game group did when this expansion came out, when Mutant Genesis came out, obviously the Mutant Genesis box set came with 2 heroes, but the company also shipped 2 additional heroes at the same time, so we had 4 total. So we went ahead and got our game group together, and we kind of did it openly this time, where we just handed out one of the decks to each of the players and said, have at it, make a weird deck, and we said each player just has to have a different aspect. So what I'm going to present to you are just the weird sort of deck ideas and synergies that the players came up with. These aren't necessarily the best strategies in the world, but I thought it was fun, and it was something different we did on this expansion. So I'll just go ahead and go into that. So the Shadowcat player, which is our typical player that loves protection, said, hey, I want to make a protection deck around this character. And this is kind of what they came up with. So This player really liked Ready to Rumble. It says after you change form, discard this card to ready your hero. So what she really enjoyed when she put this deck together was literally the concept of being able to ready your hero multiple times and whatnot. And then in addition to that, exhausting Shadowcat to kind of be able to flip back and forth. So by using attack events to kind of shift this card and typically favor the phased mass form, because that's the one where you can soak up damage from the villain. So this, in my opinion, was a pretty successful strategy. So in conjunction to that, some other things that she kind of put into the deck that synergized well was really this concept of using Tackle. And this is a card that we hardly ever use, but we thought it was kind of a funny thing that the player came up with. So this one says, stun an enemy if you paid for this card using a physical resource. But when you're in solid mass form, you can use this card to pay for an attack, which this is, although it's a protection card. And then it also requires a physical resource. So kind of what was fun is that she kept stunning the enemy using Tackle, which I thought was kind of amusing. And then in addition to that, she kept using defensive training, so there were a couple copies of defensive training in her deck. And you can take a green event, and since this is a green event, although it's an attack event, she could kind of cycle it back and then shuffle it back into the deck. So I thought that was kind of a fun synergy. And then in addition to that, she played copies of Perseverance. Obviously, she had 3 of these in the deck, and there's new artwork for this set. This one's great too. It says after you change form, give your hero a tough status card. Well, that works really well when you're constantly changing form using this mass form upgrade. So I thought that was a lot of fun. In addition to that, she kept playing obviously a lot of copies of Perseverance, and then Flow Like Water. That's a kind of a classic card that you can play, that when you play a defense card, you deal 1 damage to the attacking enemy. So from the perspective of having sort of a unique, fun deck, I think this player kind of knocked it out of the park with having a fun protection deck. I for sure had fun kind of watching this player do all these weird combos, and it was really neat because now we're in the X-Men block. So fighting like a new villain and then having these new characters and kind of mixing in some older and classic cards into the mix, I thought it was really fun and really exciting. To kind of give a quick overall summary of Shadowcat, there's a couple things that I want to focus on a little bit. One, there's a lot of this stuff that is kind of situational, in which you have to have different types of crisis icons out, or guard or patrol characters out in the game, and then you have to have certain upgrades out to really maximize that sort of playstyle. I found that to be a little bit hard sometimes for some of the players to remember to do it. So even if that situation did occur, oftentimes the player was forgetting to do it. So I found that could be a little bit clunky. So if you're kind of new to the game, just be sure that you really read those effects really carefully and you try to stay focused on that, because you can lose a lot of those opportunities when they come up. And then in addition to that, obviously we've seen the phasing mechanic numerous times in this game. So I felt that Shadowcat is an interesting character. I didn't really feel like there's too much of anything that's kind of new to the game when it came to Shadowcat. I did enjoy watching the protection player play it, and I actually played their protection deck once, and I had a good time with it. So overall, I think she's a pretty standard sort of average style character. I do think that she's fun to play. I do think that you probably need a player that's a little bit more advanced to play this character effectively, just so they can remember to trigger all of the events. And then sometimes too, when you're changing mass forms, some of the players can find that a little bit confusing and hard to play. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to continue on and make videos, one for each of the other characters that kind of came out with Mutant Genesis at the same time. So I'm going to be doing the same thing and just really reporting on some of the deck ideas that the other players had when they put their decks together for like Colossus and Phoenix and Cyclops. So stay tuned for those videos in the future, and as always, have fun gaming.